The following is a real recording of a real coaching session. If you're interested in getting some coaching yourself, you can find the link in the description. Thanks and enjoy the video. Yeah, like I say, the best kind of route for us to go down is just to start by kind of talking through the types of stuff that you've been studying since the last time we got together for some sessions, because that was quite a while back now. I can't even remember specifically when it was, but it was at least a year or two. So I think the general idea would be, what kind of progress do you think you've made, or do you feel like you've made in that time, and what's been your primary focus really?
Yeah, well, since we last had some sessions, switched over to tournaments more than
Hmm.
cash, which I think I've been enjoying a lot more. I think I enjoy the competitive aspect of tournaments rather
Sure.
than cash games were still good, but feeling like uh, everyone's there for a different reason, and you're there to take all their money and take it seriously. Um,
Hmm.
it just didn't quite tickle the competitive edge for me.
Sure.
Um, Tournament wise, sort of had to start from the bottom up. I feel like I had a relatively good baseline from cash,
Hmm.
but adjusting to, relearning pre-flop.
Yeah.
Um, the ranges are pretty similar, but just how ICM affects them a little bit. And when we can start jamming, where we can jam from, those sorts of things I had to relearn a little bit. And then post flop is, again, similar-ish, but, just learning about what candidates can do what.
Yeah.
Um, just, still progressing my knowledge of post flop as well, because it was fine learning cash,
Sure.
but there's always more to learn. So
Yeah.
a lot of just fundamentals really, but it would be good to touch up on everything for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a reasonable approach to take, and I think we talked a little bit on Discord about kind of focusing on mostly chip EV stuff. Do you
Mhm.
want to kind of run me through from the chip EV domain, I guess, what are maybe some of the areas where you feel like you haven't really had a chance yet to, really dive into the specifics, and really kind of, what are maybe some of the areas you feel like you're lacking a bit of confidence in?
Yeah, I think a lot of multi-way stuff, how we react as soon as there's someone calling behind. I've done a little bit of work from the small blind and big blind, when there's a middle position open, button
Hmm.
flats, what you do from the small blind and big blind. But
Yeah.
on the button in the cutoff, how aggressive we can be, or if we want to be passive,
Hmm.
um, sorts of things. And then I think another thing that'll be good to look at is kind of how we react to jams as well. What
Okay.
are our fresh calling off multi-way and then heads up as well, I think could be good.
Okay.
And then what affects those ranges as well, and how loose we can get when we think people are jamming wider than they're supposed to, and how tight we have to be when we think
Okay.
that people are jamming much tighter than
Sure.
they're supposed to.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think there's not going to be a ton of spots where you should call wider than what is, the
Yeah,
optimal call frequency. There's really not going to be
sure.
very many, because the default kind of approach that most people are going to have is they're not going to be finding enough of the jams. And
Yeah.
in particular, what's also really relevant is that there's a lot of situations where people are supposed to take some of the strongest hands and not jam them and play a
Yeah.
non all in 3-bet. And
Mhm.
if they don't do that, and they do jam with aces and kings in situations where maybe they're supposed to click back 4-bet or something like that,
Mhm.
then now their jamming range gets stronger, and we have even less incentive to be calling off light.
Yeah.
And so I would probably be a bit more preoccupied with just understanding the adaptations that get made when people are too tight,
Yep.
because that's just so much more common. And I think a lot of the time that type of dynamic is going to come down to a question of just having a fairly simple, the heuristic I like to use for these types of situations is that if you're very confident that your opponent is playing pure jam with hands that you're dominating, you shouldn't fold. And it's as simple
Yep.
as that. Like if you have sevens and you're facing a jam and you're very confident they're pure jamming sixes, fives, whatever, like even if it's
Mhm.
just sixes, you shouldn't fold sevens, right? And then when you start adding elements of ICM, you can say, okay, well, I want to add an extra pip or an extra 2 pips or whatever based on how high your risk premium is. But bottom line is that it does actually usually end up being pretty much the case that if your opponent is not jamming a hand that you are way ahead of, then
Mhm.
is usually going to be not a great spot to try to get it in. And so that's kind of the shortcut for, not only in theory, but also in practice, how you kind of want to look at these situations. Because there are tons of spots in theory, but there are tons of spots in theory where, your opponent is supposed to be jamming relatively wide, but they won't even be close to that in practice, right? There's like a lot of situations where they're supposed to jam there's spots where you're supposed to jam like 40 bigs from the big blind against button, and people just don't do that. And when they do it, they certainly don't have the hands they're supposed to have. So it's, I think it's really just a case of, building up a couple of heuristics that you can use and just having a clear idea of where the thresholds are based on just the fact that calling off it's a pure equity decision, right? It's literally just a math problem of how much equity do I need? How much equity do I have? And then the good thing about kind of what you mentioned there about multi-way stuff is that being multi-way doesn't really complicate this very much. And the main reason for that is that in tons of cases, if you are, let's say you're the pre-flop raiser, and then there's a call and then there's a jam, that calling range in a lot of cases is going to be pretty much purely composed of hands that are folding. And it shouldn't be, but it will be. Right. Yeah. They're just so capped when they call. So I think the majority of the spots where you actually have to worry about it are going to be situations where the calling range is not as capped as it could be, or when the calling range is coming from, a stronger player or has some traps in there. But even then, it's going to mostly be a question of adding just kind of a pip or two in terms of how high off or how high up we are capable of calling. So to kind of illustrate this, let me load up Octopi a second, and I will show you what I mean. Obviously, everyone's going to have different sims that they use. The Wizard library is still great. The GTO Lab library is great. Octopi library is great. There's all sorts of tools. So I'm not going to split hairs about which tool you should use for getting your pre-flop ranges or anything like that. And, obviously I'm on board with Octopi now, so I'm clearly going to tell people to favor that one. But the baseline here just has to be that we have, some kind of an understanding of the things that are common about all kinds of chip EV situations when we're facing jams. Let's go to 30 big blind chip EV, because I think that's a good stack size to look at here, because there's a lot of spots here where your villains are supposed to have jams and they just don't. So let's say we go, hijack open, button call, and you can see we've got all three ranges right here. Small blind is supposed to have tons of jams here, right? Small blind is supposed to jam all sorts of hands, like sevens through jacks, ace jack off, ace king off, suited Broadway stuff, just a lot of stuff that's completely fine with jamming for 30 bigs. And that is with oops, I didn't mean to do that. There we go. That's with the button having this range here that includes low frequency queens, tiny frequency aces, but not really. Low frequency queens, low frequency jacks, like decent frequency tens, like 40% of the time calling tens, 48% calling nines. Calling ace queen half the time. Like this is stuff that people are not doing at 30 bigs, because they're just like, oh, I have 30 bigs, I have ace queen, I want to get chips in. And if those hands suddenly disappear, then now if you look at what happens, let's say oops, that's not what I wanted. Let's say small blind jams, comes back to hijack here, and hijack folds. And now button is, left to act behind. Button is supposed to have a quarter of their range that's capable of calling this jam. And in the end, I think in a lot of cases, that range is probably going to be about half of this, right? Because they probably aren't going to call like the king queen suited. People don't tend to call those for 30 bigs very often. They might fold some ace jacks and ace tens. They might fold the sevens. So really they might end up only really having like nines and eights, and maybe ace queen suited or ace jack suited that call here. So they might have just way fewer calls than this, which means we just end up getting so much more fold equity. And it's just going to increase the EV of our jams. And then even if you look at the original, hijack call off range, they're supposed to call off ace 10 suited, which people generally just won't do in a lot of cases, right? King jack suited is supposed to mix calls off. Again, not really very likely to happen. And even then, if you go one step even further and you say, okay, well, once hijack calls, what is button supposed to overcall? Well, in 99% of cases, the button will have literally zero overcalls after it goes jam and then hijack calls off. They'll just fold everything. They'll fold their entire range. But in this case, they not only are they supposed to have some traps that call off here with queens, jacks, they're also supposed to never fold ace queen suited, never fold tens, never fold nines. And I really don't think you're going to see very many spots in chip EV circumstances where it goes, raise, call, jam, call, and then nines just puts it in, right? It just doesn't really happen very much. So it's kind of there's like it's a recursive thing where, because the hijack just is unlikely to find the call offs with sevens, king jack suited, ace 10 suited, the button is unlikely to find the overcalls with nines, maybe even tens, maybe even jacks. Like maybe they do fold jacks here. I don't know. But it just comes down to that extra little bit of fold equity from both players. And, then that just allows us to jam quite a bit. But when we're when we're in the hijack, with that call off range, where is it? This is the hijack call off range. Sorry. The sevens being in there is a direct product of the, the sevens being in there is a direct product of, well, actually it's a product of the overlay that's in the pot here. Sevens is a mix because villain is jamming sevens sometimes, and they're not actually jamming anything that sevens dominates, but because there's enough flips in there, sevens is just about like mixing the call off, right? But because there's that overlay of two big blinds in there, the pocket eights, I keep forgetting that I can just keep them all up there. Because of the slight overlay, the pocket eights is now in a position where it never folds, right? And it's making like two big blinds by calling off. So pocket eights never folds, even though sevens is mixing. If we just like highlight this and this, right? Sevens is mixing jams, so eights never folds. Eights is almost pure jam, so nines never folds, and so on. King 10 suited is pure jam, so king jack suited actually has an incentive to call off. And in particular, ace 10 suited, which is not only beating king 10 suited, queen 10 suited, and jack 10 suited, but it's also beating ace 9 suited as well. That ace 10 suited now has an incentive to call off, right? So if our opponent misses jams with all this suited Broadway stuff, like if they don't jam these hands, a lot of this portion of strong Broadway, strong ace high stuff that calls off has no reason to do so anymore. And if they never jam sevens, then, we have no reason to call off sevens here, even just to kind of mix call offs. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. Yeah, I've been looking at a bit of small blind stuff, and it gets even cooler when you get deeper because the button is even less likely to have any sort of traps. Like when we're 40 or 50 bigs deep, the odds of that letting queens, kings, aces is now 0. We're in 30 bigs.
Yeah. And that's exactly, if you look at like 60 is a stack that I've studied quite a bit recently. And if you look at same formation at 60, button now flats, like they're supposed to almost pure 3-bet queens and jacks. Well, definitely pure 3-bet queens, almost pure jacks. Tens is kind of 50-50. But once they call, we still have jams even for 60 here, right? Against 2.3 and call. We have queen jack suited, king jack suited, mixing ace king and ace queen off, and then tens, right? So we still have some jams, even for 60.
I think as soon as if we start editing buttons range as well to just have no traps, which I think they're very unlikely to do, then you just get to go crazy.
Because tens now, we're jamming tens here, but tens is now in a position where if it gets through the hijack, it never gets called by better, because if the button has no jacks instead of only a small frequency of jacks, like that low frequency that tens actually runs into a hand that has it crushed it becomes 0. And that's really powerful,
Yeah, exactly.
And the same goes for, if they were to 3-bet tens pure here, that would be even more so the case, right? And I think there's also a lot to be said for just the fact that there's a lot of 3-bets that come in from this range here that if we assume that the likelihood of certain hands 3-betting is going to actually be lower, like if they're not finding all their 3-bets with these offsuit Broadways, or they're not finding all their 3-bets with the suited Broadways or the suited connectors or whatever, then you might end up, instead of like a scenario where they have about 16% calls and 10% 3-bets, you might end up with them having like 22% calls and only like 5% or 4% 3-bets, because they just 3-bet the value stuff and then they kind of forget to 3-bet all the bluffs, right?
Yeah.
So in that case, it just, obviously it means we should play differently against the 3-bet, but it also means that when they flat, we just have that much more reason or opportunity or incentive to really target that flatting range, or target that sort of
Absolutely.
that capped range when we're the
we
player who's jamming. Turn that light off right there. Better. So ultimately, yeah, we get to have plenty of jams all the way up to 60 or so here. And then when we're looking at other types of scenarios, one spot that I think you'll see players getting wrong a lot is kind of the similar spot where they end up in the big blind, right? Because now from big blind, we still have jams here, but it actually gets a little bit more ambiguous, because in this case, not only do we have more jams in the sense that, not only do we have the hands that are jamming now are forced to choose between jam and then, call closing the action, but we also don't have quite such an incentive with this 3-betting range. We don't have to really, like, there's only 2 players left to act now, and there's no uncapped range behind us except for the opener, right? There's no, like, when we're in the small blind, there's the big blind left to act behind who's completely uncapped. But now our calling range, like, we don't have to protect our calling range. We don't have to care about having any sort of trappy stuff in our calling range, because there's nobody left to protect against, which is not the case, on the button or even in the small blind. Like, if you look here, at the very least, our calling range, we have to make sure that our calling range here isn't necessarily composed purely of stuff that's so weak that when the big blind calls 4 ways, like, we just never win the pot, right? Like, we still have to have some suited aces and things like that, right? So we have to have some degree of board coverage. But after the small blind folds and we're in the big blind, we don't have to care about that anymore. So it's completely fine for us to just speculate with a bunch of suited stuff with our calling range. And then our 3-bet range and jam range, basically the 3-bet range just becomes very, very linear, right? It's a lot of these strong suited hands, strong high card hands. The only exceptions being some of this ace jack suited through ace 9 suited that starts to mix instead of 3-betting pure. And the only reason for that is that if we look at, let's say, comparing ace jack to king jack, when we have king jack suited, we can fold out ace jack off. But when we have ace jack suited, we can't fold out ace queen off, but we also can't get called by ace 10 off, right? So there's a little bit, we can't quite, get value there, but we also can't bluff. So this is sort of how the dynamic is going to shape up here in most instances, or in most cases. And I think the mistake that people tend to make in this spot is they just don't find enough of these 3-bets, right? They're far too content to not 3-bet a hand like 10-9 suited, because they just don't want to be forced to not see a flop, right? The last thing they want is to be prevented from seeing a flop. But in reality here, if we look at what happens after it goes squeeze like this, the hijack's response is surprisingly passive, in that there is a good chunk of jamming, but there's also a quarter of the time they're just flatting here with the button left to act behind. And it's because of how capped the button is. And if you look at, button overcall range, they are forced to be quite conservative here with how often they call and go 3 ways to a flop in a 3-bet pot. But they're also supposed to have some back jams, right? It's supposed to go like 3-bet flat back jam here at some frequency. And that doesn't happen either, right? Like, I just can't remember the last time I ever got into a pot like this where it went squeeze, call, back jam. And, we actually saw like somebody back jam, I don't know, ace, queen, jacks, 10s, whatever here, right? So
just aces.
Yeah. I mean, even then, like, it's not really, it just doesn't happen, So I think it's a circumstance that, when you account for the fact that the frequency that actually happens pretty much goes from, non-zero down to 0, obviously that does account for some EV, or it changes our EV to some degree. And it's a nice thing for us to be able to account for. Right.
Yeah.
So this is kind of the way that we are approaching some multi-way concepts to look at some multi-way post concepts. This is kind of useful, because I put together, like, Octopi has this database thing, but I mostly use it right now for just either using it as kind of a hand replayer to be able to look at a hand visually, or to create an artificial hand that I can kind of walk through and study. So what I did for a couple of sessions I've used this hand for recently is basically just create like a three-way hand to
Mhm.
allow us to sort of discuss some of the principles of multi-way spots and how certain, how we want to approach certain three-way spots and even four-way spots as well. So this is just a basic kind of 100 big blind deep spot. We don't really have like a sim for it or anything, but that's because it's going to go three ways to the flop. So I just want to use it as a foundation to talk through, how we're approaching these three-way situations. So
Yeah.
we're not going to really look at us as being any specific player here. We're just going to have this low jack open range. So pretty standard 2.5x at 100 bigs. Button's going to flat, and then big blind's going to overcall. And we're going to go three ways to a flop on jack 9-4. I think to start with, I think it's pretty clear big blind is just going to never donk here. So we're just going to play pure check. But let's put ourselves in the low jack's shoes for now. Talk me through how you're going to approach kind of building a strategy for this spot. And then I'll talk you through what I think is a useful way to make it simpler or look at it.
Yeah, cool. I think the low jack can bet relatively often for a bigger size in this spot, because I think we can apply pressure to a lot of flats that'll be either drawing or slightly weak top pairs. I don't think we necessarily have to be super balanced. We can obviously find bluffs, but if we have ace jack, king jack, over pairs, things like that, we can start getting value from, jack X, maybe some 9x in the buttons range.
I think I lost you. Your audio cut out there for a second. You want to say that last part again?
Yeah, I think we can start getting value from buttons, jack X, maybe some 9x as well. And then, they're also going to have some draws like queen 10, some gut shots that we can get value from, gut shots with a backdoor and things like that. So I think when we do that, we want to be betting a little bit bigger. And yeah, I don't think we necessarily have to be super balanced with it either, again, because the button is going to be pretty capped a lot of the time.
Okay. So I think there's a couple things about that I would want to sort of shift around. I guess, how can I put this? Let me just start with breaking down the way that I would tend to look at multi-way pots. And I think hopefully what we can start to talk about is that the approach that you've described there is kind of how most people approach multi-way, which is to basically not really do a lot of bluffing and to just be kind of value heavy. But I think when you consider that there's so many nodes on turn and river when the flop is multi-way, or even when the turn is multi-way, that are just misplayed and overfolded and things like that. I think it actually becomes quite a significant leak to go into multi-way spots with an approach of I'm just going to get value when I have good hands. And then when I don't have good hands, I'm going to like mostly just do a lot of checking. So what I would want to look at for this spot is, first of all, we need a methodology of figuring out who's favored in this situation when we're evaluating the flop, right? So we need to have a system for that. And what I kind of put together for some of my videos for Solve for Why is this approach where we essentially look at the three ranges that are in play, or even more than that, 4 ranges, 5 ranges, whatever, and we just rank them in order of which is strongest, right? And in this case, it's pretty clearly the low jack that is the strongest range because they have all the overpairs. Button doesn't really have any. Big blind is pretty clearly the weakest range. So the third range here being the big blind, they're out of position. The first range is in the middle, and the second range is in position. So this is what I would call like a 3-1-2 formation. And then you've got the other two formations that exist at some frequency are going to be 1-2-3, which is pre-flop raiser opens early position and then gets called by 2 in position players and the blinds fold. So that's 1-2-3, where the first person to act is the strongest range. And then you've got 2-3-1, which is open from middle or late or something, small blind calls, and then big blind overcalls. In that case, small blind has the middle range, the second strongest range. Big blind has the weakest, and then the pre-flop raiser who has the strongest range is also in position. And with this being a 3-1-2 formation, this is a scenario where if we're in the low jack, we are going to get to be relatively aggressive, but at the same time, we have to make sure that we're doing it from a perspective that at this level of depth, at this, 100 big blinds plus, in a situation where the button can have at least 2 of the 3 sets here, probably all 3 at some frequency, and the big blind can have at least 2 of them. Maybe 9's a bit less often, but the big blind can definitely have 4s. Big blind can probably have some suited 2 pairs here, and big blind can have jack 9 off. And there's not that many turn runouts, which are really clean for our overpairs here. I do think we can do a decent amount of betting, but I don't think it's a board where we get to start shoveling in a ton of money. And I think that's going to be pretty true about a ton of multi-way spots. The multi-way spots where we are actually able to bet quite big on the flop, like more than half pot type stuff, it's going to be board textures where the overpairs are just very rarely going to run into better. So for example, a flop like 5 deuce rainbow, where our jacks, queens, kings, aces, like maybe they run into a deuce sometimes, but the big blind never has an offsuit deuce in their range. So it's really rare that we actually run into that, right? Stuff like that, we can bet big. Stuff like ace, king, blank, rainbow, right? We can have some big bets there because we have all the ace, king, we have all the aces, we have all the kings. They don't have any of it. There's a lot of boards like that where we can bet bigger. And this would be a fine board for some bigger bets in a heads up spot. But I think the ceiling of how big we would probably want to bet here multi-way would probably be something around half pot. I wouldn't really want to go too much bigger than that. And the reason for that is simply that I don't want to be forced into a situation where it's really, really difficult to pick appropriate bluffs, right? Because what happens with a lot of people is whenever they start to try to size up, the problem is that they pretty quickly lose track of what hands are actually going to be good bluffs. And then they end up sizing up with a range of hands that's far too value heavy, right? So for example, like a lot of people, if they bet 2/3 pot on this flop, if they bet 6 bigs into 9, they're just going to have like king jack plus, and then they're going to have king queen, queen 10, maybe 10-8, maybe king 10. And then they're going to have literally no low equity hands. And then what ends up happening is, first of all, your checking range becomes absurdly weak. And then second of all, when you bet the flop and the turn completes some kind of a draw, you literally can't bluff because you have no bluffs left, right? So we don't want that. We don't want that because there's so many overfolded nodes and overfolded runouts here that we want to make sure that we can still have some bluffs. I would want to make sure that we bet a size that doesn't either force us to put a ton of money in with some really weak and sketchy kind of bluffs, or put us in a position of finding it really difficult to really find bluffs at all. So I would go, if I was going to pick a single size here, I'd go something like 4 big blinds, maybe 5, but probably not any bigger than 5. Going smaller than that is also fine. Small bets are a pretty decent. It's just almost never going to be bad to go small multi-way. So I might just hedge and go 3.5, something like that. But the type of bluffs we're going to want to have are mostly going to be, we're obviously going to want to bet some of those draws, but we're also going to want to bet a lot of bottom pair stuff that we could possibly have here. So ace 4 suited with a backdoor, ace 5 suited, ace 5-4 suited with a backdoor, because we have the ability to bet those hands. And then sometimes the button's going to fold a pocket pair that's actually beating us. So we can bet ace 4 and they fold pocket 5s, and that's a great outcome, right? Same for the big blind. They can fold that hand. We can bluff with deuces and 3s here because we have incredibly clean turnouts and we unblock all the folding stuff. We can fold out better pairs. We can bluff ace 3 and ace deuce suited with a backdoor, ace 5 suited with a backdoor. We can bluff some frequency of maybe some stuff like 7-6 with a backdoor, 6-5 with a backdoor, king 8 with a backdoor. Like there's a few different hands that we can kind of throw in there into a bluffing range here. But the important thing is that we just need to make sure that we have some low equity bluffs in there, because there are just going to be so many good bluff spots on later streets. Now the low jack is in theory going to have hands that check raise for value, and check raise is a bluff, of course, which is partly why the solver is going to want to mix a lot of the pre-flop. It's going to want to mix on the flop when it comes to deciding between bet and check. And it's going to want to mix so that it can have hands that check and then check raise. In practice, I think a lot of people are not going to do that. They're not really going to be actually mixing. And that's going to kind of lead them in either one direction or the other in terms of how they're actually constructing, depending on whether they're more inclined to just go for a straight up value, or if they're like like to get a bit tricky. But regardless here, in this hand history that I've created, the big blind's going to check and then low jack's going to check. So now talk me through what we think the button's range is going to look like. And I'm just going to put the light back on here because I think it's a bit dark for me over here. There we go.
Yeah, I think the button can bet relatively often. I think in theory, low jack is going to be relatively protected with their checks. I think in practice, they're not going to be. So maybe at equilibrium, there's plenty of jack X still there. Strong jack X, maybe some open-ended straight draws that they can check once and things like that. But I think in practice, when the low jack does check, it is quite capped.
Okay.
So I think the button can bet pretty often. I think the bluffs come from very similar places. So some of our open-ended straight draws, under pairs and things like that. I think bluffing 4x and hands like that is pretty cool because, yeah, like you said, we get called by worse hands and then we fold out better. We're going to get calls from 10-8 suited in the big blind. But
exactly. It's kind of it's a merge, right? It's like it's a merge in the sense that we have the ability to achieve more than one different thing. And then it kind of becomes a hand that, depending on who calls and what the action is, we can either convert it into a bluff if we improve and we have the ability to now barrel with equity, or if we just decide we have showdown value because, maybe the turn's a complete brick and we still win against draws, like maybe we can just check, right? So there's a lot of good hands like that have an incentive to bet for sure. Button does bet 2 here. And this is where I think it starts to become important that we talk about some of the principles of how multi-way pots work. And if you use Wizard's 3-way solver, if you use Rocket solver, which I use a lot, anything that you use that starts solving multi-way stuff, HRC as well, what you'll see is that there's a pretty decent rule of thumb here, which is that if you're facing a bet and the player left to act behind you or players left to act behind you are players that have a stronger range than you, then usually you don't want to do any raising. So in this case, if the big blind is facing a bet from the button, the big blind has the low jack still left to act behind, and the low jack is significantly stronger than the big blind here. So the big blind has to be quite cautious about protecting themselves against the potential check raises that the low jack might have. And second of all, the big blind has to be mindful that with their strong hands, the perfect scenario here is they're able to get value from both players and not just one. So if they have a set or something, they don't actually really benefit from raising here against the button and making the low jack fold a lot. What they actually benefit from is calling and forcing the low jack to do a bunch of check raising and so on. So in this formation, 3-1-2, when the number 2 range bets here, the number 3 in the big blind is going to just play call or fold. Now in practice, people won't do that because they don't really know this principle and they don't really know too much about how multi-way works in a lot of cases. So you will find that they give you a lot of opportunities to get away from hands. Yeah. Because you bet 2 on the button here and they just raise to 8. And now you're in the low jack with like kings and you can just fold, right? Because most of the time, even though kings, like I've actually tested this. And if you node lock somebody and you force them to raise here in the big blind, the low jack will play a pretty complex strategy. If I force the big blind to raise to 7 here with like a balanced range, the low jack will play some calls. They'll play some clickbacks to like 18, and then they'll play some folds. So it does make things very complicated for the low jack. But if you node lock it to be a value heavy range, which is what it's going to be in most cases, like it's just not going to be a lot of bluffs there. The low jack has a lot of, pretty clear folds. Big blind is supposed to play call or fold. And in this case, they do call. So for now, let's assume that the big blind is going to play pretty well. They're going to play pretty close to optimally. Where do we think the thresholds are here for that big blind call, right? So if we just go back to, I don't know why it says check over here. Let's scroll it back a little bit. Big blind call. Okay. So where do we think the threshold is of hands that the big blind's going to call versus some of the stuff that they might just fold?
I think Their made hands are definitely going to be around Jack X. Their stronger hands, their calling range would be, two paired, Jack 9, some Jack 4, maybe some 9-4 suited as well. So there'll be a couple of combos of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I
and
think we can kind of shortcut it here a little bit by saying it's obvious that they're not folding any Jack or better, right? Clearly they're playing call with those. The next step down is going to be, do they ever fold a 9? And I think the answer is probably no there as well. I don't think they should fold a 9 here. I think facing 2 big blinds, it's probably too strong to fold.
Yeah.
And I think that if they were facing like 4, it might be a bit different. A 9 might start to fold because hands do start to become a lot more price sensitive multi-way. But I think a 9 versus less than quarter pot here, I think a 9 should call. Then we start to get to like pocket 8s through 5s. And that stuff is a bit more problematic because that stuff has a lot less in the way of outs to improve. And so I would expect that what's probably supposed to happen here, what's probably going to happen is that 8s through 5s fold, and then any 4, depending on the kicker, depending on whether it has a backdoor, is probably pretty close, right? So like if you have a 4 with a backdoor, you probably can't fold, but a 4 without a backdoor, or a 4 with, in particular, a 4 with a kicker that completes a straight. So stuff like 7-4, 8-4, 10-4, Queen 4, King 4, maybe not 9-4. Yeah, that sort of stuff gets a lot worse. So Ace 4 might call, and then like 6-4 and below with a backdoor would probably call.
Like clean air and trip outs. Is that what we're looking?
Yeah, exactly. Clean outs. Yeah, you want clean outs here. With a 9, you have enough equity that you don't have to care that much about the outs, but you still would prefer to have like Ace 9 here compared to 8-9. It's going to have higher EV there.
In practice, when we think that the low Jack doesn't have like a protected checking range, are we then more incentivized to call wider with some of our under pairs?
I would say no. I would say no. I would say no, because the defining factor here in whether we can actually continue or not is not the low Jack's range, it's the button's range, right? The defining factor in whether we have raises or not is how protected the low Jack's range is. So if the low Jack doesn't have any check raises here, then now our strong hands start to want to raise. So we would start to build a raising range and just not care about the fact that the low Jack's going to fold. But
because they have queens, kings.
Exactly. But in order for us to call with 8s, 7s, 6s, 5s here, we would need a couple of things. We would need the low Jack to be very capped here to where not only are they never check raising, but they're also not calling very much either. Because, them check raising is actually, honestly, we probably, if they check raise when we have like 7s, we just fold. But if they overcall and we have to play the turn out of position 3 ways, that's just as bad.
Yeah.
So
their calls are always going to be like 9x and Jack X anyway, which we're
precisely, we're just crushed by, right? So it's not about the low Jack so much, it's about the button. If we wanted to call with 7s here, for example, we would need the low Jack to be very, very capped to where they're very often folding. And we would need the buttons range to be wide enough that, we're quite confident they have quite a few bluffs in there, which in practice is quite rare. And then on top of that, we would also need the button to be playing pretty passively on the later streets to the point where either they're just going to let us show down pocket 7s way too often, which is just really rare because like, how do you actually get to showdown and win with 7s on this board, right? Like you have to have such a specific run out and you need them to give up as well. Or we need them to kind of allow us to turn 7s into a bluff at a higher frequency in some way in order for us to start to make money with it. But it's just really hard to parlay in that kind of way, right? So
there's too many variables.
Yeah, I would just mostly just look at 7s through 5s and just dump them here. It's just annoying, but like you just fold them.
It makes sense.
Now, if it was Jack 6-4, I wouldn't fold 7s, but it's a different issue. So the bottom line here, I think, is that the nature of the low Jack's range is going to affect whether or not we have a raising range. And to some extent, it might allow us to specifically widen up our range with maybe some of the draws that, like the very weak draws, like the weakest draw here would be like 8-7, right? 8-7 here would have no ability to continue against a check raise from the low jack. And it would have some significant reverse implied odds as well against the button. So 8-7 would be the kind of hand that probably folds to even a pretty small bet from the button here. But against, if the low jack has no check raises, now 8-7 might be okay, right? So that's the stuff that, and maybe like a 4 without a backdoor becomes okay now, instead of needing to have a 4 with a backdoor. But the middle pocket pairs and like 3s and deuces and like random ace high and just fold.
Yeah.
So the next thing, is going to be, okay, the low jack actually does just fold. And now we've got this interesting circumstance. And this is another thing about this specific formation, which is the 3-1-2, where you've got the big blind calling a bet from the button. It's that because the big blind is uncapped when they call here, they're just playing call or fold on the flop. They now have a totally different range on this turn card to what they would normally have if this was just heads up button versus big blind.
Yeah.
They don't have a very capped range here. They still have all their sets, all their 2 pairs, and now they have straights too. So this is actually a turn, and I can say this because I did run the sim of this just to check. This is a turn where the big blind is supposed to have some donks. They're supposed to donk for about 3/4 pot, actually, because the idea is that they're taking all their 2 pairs, their jack-7, their 9-7 suited. They have 4-7 that's in there too, and they're 10-8 and stuff like that. And they're kind of taking those hands and using them to put a jack in a tough spot, because now the button has a lot of jack X, some 9X, some bluffs, obviously, but the big blind has 10-8 offsuit and the button can't have that. And the big blind actually has more straights than the button here. So big blind does have quite a few donks here. And this happens a lot in these spots. It happens quite frequently that even if the turn was a brick here, the big blind might have some donks. And this is like one of the weird things that happens. Normally you would never get donks on a brick in a basic heads up pot, but in a pot that starts multi-way, you can start to see donks on a brick, and you can start to see some very weird donk sizes in certain specific types of spots when very particular turn cards come out. For example, on this turn card, the 7 is going to be very much favoring big blind. The 8 is probably going to be favoring big blind to a decent degree as well, because they have 10-7, possibly even 10-7 off. The 10 is probably not going to favor big blind because button has more king queen than they do, and button also has 8-7. Big blind would have queen 8, but it's not that big of a deal. And then the king would be a bit more neutral because they both have queen 10. They would both have some 2 pairs there and stuff like that. So there's a bit more of a difference in terms of which turn cards are going to affect who. And you will also see sometimes that there's a good amount of like some really big donk sizes in certain circumstances. So that's kind of a dynamic of multi-way that's quite important to recognize. The other time when this happens is if you, let's say, actually a good example of this is there will be, even though let's say you're in a 2-3-1 formation, like you're in the small blind and you call against the button open and then the big blind overcalls. So you're all 3 wide ranges.
Yeah.
There will be spots where even though, when you face a c-bet from the button there, you're going to be able to play a range that has some raises. Your calling range is going to be pretty strong with the big blind left to act behind. So quite often there'll be situations where it'll go small blind check, big blind check, button c-bet, small blind call, big blind fold. And then on a turn brick, the small blind actually can lead out because the button c-bet range is really wide. And the small blind's check call range is actually way ahead of the button's c-bet range. So there's a lot of dynamics in multi-way pots where depending on exactly which 2 players go to the next street, there's completely different strategies that exist. And, this type of scenario is really good for sort of looking at that. And as another example here, you might think that, let's say the low jack, the flop here, and then the button called, and then the big blind folded. You might think that, well, that would be a spot where low jack would have to be really cautious. But the thing is that the button doesn't have to play call or fold because they don't have to be afraid of the big blind, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the button, the button still gets to raise a lot of their fairly strong hands here. And
Yeah.
that means that when the button does just call, the low jack doesn't have to be especially afraid of that range going into the turn, right? So there's
Yeah.
all sorts of, there's a lot of
Yeah.
considerations there. But really, I think that you always want to kind of keep in mind this idea of how strong is our range relative to the other ones. And if we have a player behind us that has a stronger range than us, we have a lot of reason to play defense against that range. And then once we proceed to the later streets, we just have to look at a simple case of what are the actual two ranges in play. And sometimes that's going to mean that the player who called the previous street actually has a stronger range. And this would be one of those cases because, as I said, there wasn't a ton of donking here, but there was some large size donking, some 10 big blind donk bets here with I think it was about 15% or 10 or 15% of the big blind's range here. So quite an interesting spot. Now the strategy that the button is going to go with facing a check here is also going to be quite interesting because in a normal heads up spot, if this was button versus big blind, button open, big blind call, check bet, call, flop, we wouldn't really expect the button to have to be super cautious here in choosing their turn betting hands, or at least in particular in choosing their turn value bets. But when I ran the sim for this, the threshold for where the button starts to value bet the turn is actually pretty much ace jack plus. So stuff like king jack, queen jack doesn't really bet the turn at all here. And
Yeah.
the reason is simply that we have to account for the fact that we're up against a much more robust check calling range from the big blind than we would ever be up against if this was heads up button big blind, right?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
big blind, that big blind calling range with the low jack behind, not only is it uncapped, but it's also, even when they check the turn, and so they maybe don't have as many of very top hands in their range here, they simply just have far fewer hands that are going to be in difficult spots against the bet. And in particular, when you account for card removal, when we have a jack, the problem is that the hand that we're trying to get value from is a worse jack. But when it specifically goes check, bet, call, fold on the flop, the card removal effects are going to weight the big blind more towards having hands either better than or significantly worse than a jack, and
Yeah.
becomes a lot harder for us to get value from anything when we try to go thin with queen jack or something, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah.
we have,
And we're too in funneling money in with top.
right.
Okay,
We basically start to be pretty reluctant to go thin here on the turn, and we don't really bet top pair that often for value here unless it's a really good top pair. And then in this case, button does check back, so we get a river deuce. And now, just to kind of break down how this one's going to shape up, there's a couple of things that are quite important here. Now it actually does kind of revert a bit more towards the type of dynamic that it would be when it is just a normal heads up hand, right? Because we have the same dynamic that would usually exist in this formation where the big blind, because they check called the flop and then it went check on the turn, the big blind can still have some nutted hands here. They can still have a bit of 10-8. They can still have some two pairs. They can still have some strong jack X and so on. But the button is kind of capped. Maybe king jack is like the top of button's range now, because the button is very, very unlikely to ever check back a straight. And even though in theory they're supposed to check back if they happen to have, I think specifically 9-7 suited is the only two pair that the button can ever realistically have here. There's some jack 9 in there, but I don't, as far as I remember from the sim, that wasn't checking back the turn. I can't recall specifically, but button is supposed to have some two pairs here, but the bottom line is that they never have a straight. They never have the 10-8.
Yeah.
And that means the big blind now gets to apply a lot of pressure. But the big blind also has to, take into account that the button also doesn't have a ton of hands that are super weak here. The button also they have quite a bit of jack X, quite a bit of 9X. Some of their straight draws that just missed are completely weak, obviously, but they don't have a ton of that stuff. They don't have a ton of ace high and worse here. So the big blind is in that fairly familiar position of they're out of position. they have some draws that missed. So they have some king queen, they have some king 10, some queen 10, and those hands are clearly going to be bluffing quite a bit. They need to bluff for a big size to really apply max pressure. And then they have a good amount of Jack X, which can possibly value bet, but probably not for a very big size. Because it really, if they have like Jack 3 suited, their only chance of being able to value bet here is to get called by something like ace 9, king 9 that might have bet the flop, stuff like that. So you might expect
better off
9
and then calling off something.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, they basically have a pretty decent hand with a 9 here, but they also just they have to take the same approach as the button of being a bit more cautious because it started out as a multi-way hand, right? So the amount of block that, like, you might see quite a lot of block betting in a heads up spot here. Like a 9 would block bet a lot, a 7 might block bet, even a 4 could block bet here, given how little betting action there was. But when you look at it multi-way, you're probably going to see less block betting from a 4. You're going to see less block betting from a 7, and you're going to see a bit more of just a generally conservative strategy from both players, because a lot of the card removal factors starts to make it harder for, like, when one player has a good hand, the other player is more likely to have a bad hand, right? So it's like it's much harder to bet big for value and get called, and it's also much harder to bet big as a bluff and get a fold. So you kind of hedge a little bit, and you don't really go for as many overbets. You don't really go for as many 18 big blinds here. And instead, maybe you go pot, something like that. Maybe you have a block size with a 9, but it's like a 9 bets like 1/3 or something here. And then obviously you just take the bluffs. And the thing is that the button strategy is going to look pretty similar once the big blind checks, because the big blind checking, they're going to have some check raises, but they're not going to have a ton. They're probably pretty unlikely to ambitiously go for a check raise here with something like a jack, but 9-7 maybe, because it unblocks a jack that could try to check raise. 10-8 could try to check raise, obviously, but you're not going to face a ton of raises. The dynamic here is mostly going to just be, I think, that the button is pretty much going to still be able to value bet a lot of their king jack and ace jack and queen jack. But beyond that, once you get to like jack 10, it's a bit more close. They probably can't easily value bet a 9 here. I would be surprised if they value bet a 9 in theory. Maybe if you went to like 7 bigs instead of like 10, you could value bet an ace 9 possibly. But a lot of the time here, again, if you have a 9, your opponent is more likely to have a busted draw or a jack. So you just have a lot less incentive to go thin. So the card removal stuff, once you go 2 players beyond the flop after the flop was multi-way, the card removal stuff does start to matter, because you've got an extra folded range in here. That's this is a slightly more specific range of hands that specifically opens, checks the flop, and then folds on this board. And that's kind of much more weighted towards hands that don't interact with this board at all, which means everything, all the rest of the card removal stuff gets amplified when you consider how it affects the button versus big blind spot here.
It's sort of condensed.
Yeah, so it's a pretty interesting sort of a dynamic. Like I say, there's more and more ways these days that you can explore multi-way post flop, whether it's Wizard, whether it's HRC, whether it's Rocket Solver, where we're getting closer and closer to the point where it is pretty feasible to solve multi-way pots pretty well. And there's starting to be more and more principles that we can kind of develop from that and extrapolate and start to apply into different situations. So it's kind of a cool thing for someone like myself who's been studying multi-way quite a bit for a couple of years, because it's really it's starting to become a bit more of a priority for people, and people are starting to look into how many edges are available in these spots and so on. So I'm certainly going to spend a bunch of time on it, and I would be happy to do the same in our sessions, obviously, but we can also just keep going through some general chip EV stuff. There's a whole bunch of stuff on Octopi, of course, that we can explore. And I'm happy to use other tools too. I just have to make sure that they're not competitors for Octopi. I don't want
for sure.
I don't want to annoy my bosses by featuring competitors in my YouTube videos.
Got to keep everyone happy.
Exactly. Right. Exactly.
I think multi-way stuff is always going to be super beneficial, because I think there's way more flats that happen in practice. And so knowing where your edges are going to be super important.
Yeah,
particularly
absolutely.
The amount of chips you can accumulate post is just bigger. And so understanding where to make more money post is good.
Sure. Yeah.
So multi-way, and then eventually getting into some some ICM stuff would be cool as well. I think it's
Yeah,
the area.
yeah, we can certainly do some of that. There's a lot of final table ICM stuff that we can study using the Vault here on Octopi and stuff as well. So that's
Yeah.
cool. So there's plenty of opportunity to do that. But yeah, we'll I guess over the next week or so, if you want to have a think about any specific topics that you really want to kind of do a bit more of a deep dive in, and we can, make sure that we start out with going through that next time.
Yeah.
All right. Sounds good, man.
One thing with this hand specifically,
Yeah.
was the fact that we were multi-way, was that restricting us from going absolutely bananas? Because I've seen in some sims or not sims, but just like kind of exploitatively, when our opponent has that much of a capped range where they can just never have the absolute nuts on a certain board, we just get to be all in on a board like that.
I mean, when you lock it to make sure that their range is super, super capped, then yeah, like that would still be the same, right? So like if we made it so that the button could like literally never have any better than one pair here, and the big blind still had all of their, 2-pair plus in full, the big blind would start to probably use some really big sizings. And there were some really big sizings used at some frequency in the sim that I saw. But I think the problem with those is that most of the time using them requires increasingly accurate understandings of the exact range, right? There's a lot of spots where if you know the exact range, you can shove for 10x pot. But if you're even slightly wrong, it becomes a huge punt to do that, right? So I do think that there's probably, in practice, there's probably a lot more room to use some overbet sizes, some big sizes, maybe anywhere up to, 20, 25 bigs or something here with some pretty decent frequency. But you do have to keep in mind that card removal stuff. And you also have to assume a pretty decent degree of kind of uncertainty about how other players are going to approach multi-way, because you could quite easily find a player here. Like there's certainly some player types who, when this 7 peels off on the turn against the big blind, they'll check a set because they just think, oh, 10-8 got there. It's the big blind. They can have 10-8 so easily. So that level of doubt is something you have to account for. And if you don't have any doubt, if you know for sure, then you can go crazy. But it's just a little bit hard to be confident when you're competing with tons of variables,
No, cool. That makes sense. Sweet.
Cool. All right, man. All right. Talk to you soon. See you next week. Bye.